All right, so we're lecture number 91 today. I had a couple people telling me that they wouldn't be able to attend tonight. Mostly people doing summer kind of stuff. So we are on page 419 in the Pines edition of the guide. We're in the middle of part 3, chapter 2, and we are in the middle of page 419. And if you remember the last couple lectures, we read together the chapters of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, where of the Maaseh HaMerkava, the Ezekiel's vision about God's chariot and all of the angels and the wheels and the eyes and all the like really strange stuff. And Rambam is basically giving a commentary on all of this and trying to make something meaningful out of it all. So the last time we were in the middle, we were at the place where he was talking about, it's like a little bit more than halfway down the page. He says accordingly that the living creature. So he was talking about the Targum of the Yonasan ben Uziel, the one of the Targumim on Tanakh. One of the Targum is the Aramaic translation. And he was talking about where he was talking about these creatures that were running to and fro, Ratzov Vashov, right? And he says, and Ezekiel Yechezkel said, whither the air Ruach will be, they will go, right? They turned not when they went. And we talked about how Rambam already translated that for us as meaning, they had a mission, right? A mission, and they didn't turn. They didn't deviate from the mission. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. So it was already starting to make some meaning for us. The angels have a mission from God, and they do what they're supposed to do. And remember, in Rambam's cosmology, in Rambam's understanding, angels are the powers and forces of nature. In the Rambam's Aristotelian world, that meant the angels were the intelligences that made, because remember, in Aristotelian physics, an intelligence needs to exist to tell something to move, that made the spheres that surround us, within which the stars are embedded, move. So nature does what it's supposed to do, right? That's how Rambam understands Ezekiel's vision. Nature does what it's supposed to do, right? The angels do their job. They don't deviate from one direction or another. So now I'm going to start reading. I'm reading from that sentence. He says accordingly that the living creature runs in the direction in which it is in the divine purpose that the living creature run. Yonasan ben Uziel, peace be upon him, had already interpreted this too in a similar way, saying they went wherever the will was that they should go, right? And they did not turn when going, right? Now, inasmuch as his saying reads, whither the air will be, they will go, right? Air is another translation of ruach, right? And consequently, its outer meaning signifies that sometimes God will wish in the future that a living creature should go in a certain direction, and then it would take that direction. And sometimes, again, he will wish that it should go in another direction different from the first, and it will go accordingly. So he, meaning Yonasan ben Uziel, goes back to the passage and explains this obscure point, letting us know that this is not so, right? And that yihye, right, the word yihye, mean will be, has here has the same meaning as haya, which has been, which is often the case in Hebrew. We find throughout that in Tanakh, often it uses past or future tense interchangeably. So thus, the way Yonasan ben Uziel says this is in order to emphasize even more that there is no change in the nature, not where it was and not what will be. The way God set it in place, the way God gave these angels, these forces of nature, rules by which they work, that always was that way and always will be that way, the same rule, right? Thus, the direction in which God wished the living creature to go had been determined. The living creature takes the direction that God had wished it to take. And the will is constant regarding this direction. The will, in this case, the will of God, right, is always constant. It's always the same. The world works the way it works. In order to explain this matter and to complete what he has to say about it, he's still talking about Yonasan ben Uziel. He brings another verse, and I just turned the page to 420. Whithersoever the air will go, they will go thither, as the air to go, right? Understand this wondrous explanation. This too belongs to his description of the form of the motion of the four living creatures, which comes after the description of their shapes. The four living creatures, which we mentioned before, the four animals that he saw in his vision. right? But not necessarily animals, because in one of those was a human. So the four creatures are human as one of the four animals. Then he started upon another description. Okay, so saying that he had seen a single body beneath the living creatures and adhering to them, right? So this is, he's quoting, we read this together 2 weeks ago, so I know most of us, including myself, don't remember all the details. Actually, if you allow me to take a second, I'm gonna pull it up here. All right, this is what I didn't have time to do because I was in a rush today, and I apologize. Otherwise, I would have had these verses lined up and ready to go. So this is at about verse 17 or so in the first chapter. So I have it Ezekiel. I think this is what he's referring to. Va'era hachayot, and I saw these creatures. V'hinei ofan echad ba'aretz. There was one ofan, or one wheel, etzel hachayot, near the living creatures, larbat panav, on its four faces. And then he said, "Umar'eh ha'ofanim u'masem ke'en tarshish l'dmus echad le'arbatan." Right? They gleamed like the glow of Tarshish stone, which is usually translated as beryl. U'dmus echad le'arbatan, and they all had one appearance. And remember, Rambam already told us that they all have the appearance of a human being, right? Al arbat revehen belechtam. So this body was joined to the earth and also formed four bodies, and likewise had four faces. But this he does not. This ofan echad, I think it's referring to this ofan echad. He does not describe to it any form at all, neither a man's form nor another form pertaining to living beings, but states that they were great, terrible, and fearful bodies. And he states that their bodies was all. It says v'gabehen v'gova lohem v'yira lohem. Right? Their top or their back and the height of them, they were very high and they looked very frightening. The yira lohem, they looked very scary. V'gabosam, and their edges, mileot einayim, were full of eyes, saviv li'arbatan, surrounding all of them. They are those that he calls wheels, saying, these are what he calls ofanim. I saw the living creatures, and behold, one wheel upon the earth by living creatures was four faces. So remember, this is all so when we read this, we didn't understand what he was talking about, and Rambam is kind of re-quoting it all. Accordingly, he has made it clear that it was a single body whose one extremity was by the living creatures, while the other was on the earth, and that this wheel had four faces. He says the appearance of the wheels, and I just read that verse to you, that the appearance of the wheels, and it was like the color of beryl. Thus, after having spoken of one wheel, he goes on to speak of four. Accordingly, he makes it quite clear that the four faces of the wheel, the four faces that the wheel has, are the four wheels. Then he states, now I just want to give you a thing. I know this all sounds kind of crazy, but the point that he's going to get to, right, is when he tries to make some meaning out of this. So hang in there. He wants us to sound strange. Then he explains with regard to these wheels that they were encased one within the other. For he says, and their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel betoch, right? Ofan betoch ofan. This is an expression that is not used with regard to the living creatures, for he does not use with regard to the living creatures the word toch, which means within. Rather, there he says that they adhered to each other. They called them, they were together like Isha el Achota, like a woman and her sister. As for the wheels, he states that they were encased one within the other, a wheel within a wheel. As for the whole body of the wheels, he says that it was full of eyes, which we just quoted. It is possible that he meant that they were really full of eyes, but it is also possible, and this is really fascinating, that because that it actually meant that they had many colors. Now, I use this. I was teaching in Shul a couple of weeks back, and a verse from the Navi Zechariah, where the Navi Zechariah talks about Eben Achas Shiva Einayim. On this stone, there was 7 eyes. And I used the Rambam's translation of Einayim as color, as opposed to eyes. And I'm assuming that stone was a prism that refracted light into its 7 colors. That was, but here the Rambam is saying that what it means by eyes, it doesn't mean eyes. Ayin also means color, right? It is likewise possible that they meant they were likenesses, just as we find that the ancient masters of the language say ke'en sheganav or ke'en shegazal, meaning something like. So ayin also might just mean a similarity. Ke'en is another word that also means a similarity. So it could mean color, it could mean eyes, right? Like unto one has stolen, like unto what one has robbed, right? Various states and attributes as a dictum. I just turned to the top of page 421. So then I'm gonna kind of go through this a little bit quickly, but here I'm moving down page 421. As for the motion of the wheels, he again says that there was in their motion no curve, no turning, and no deviation. There were only straight motions that did not vary. So when he talked about the living beings, God said that the image was living beings having a job from God and then doing it without turning. And when he talked about the non-living beings, these ophanim who are not alive, these wheels, he also talked about how they had many colors, right? They had many likenesses, but they also did not turn. They also went straight and did what they were supposed to do. Then he states that these four wheels do not move essentially as do the living creatures. They don't have movement that comes from themselves, right? But rather, for they have no essential motion. In Aristotelian physics, what he's talking about is they differentiated between essential motion and non-essential motion. Essential motion means a being that decides to move by him or herself. So you or I, we have a brain that says, let's walk forward. So we go. That's essential motion. We have motion that comes from within ourselves, right? Whereas the motion of a wheel comes because something pushes it, right? It doesn't move on its own. And they differentiated between these two. He insisted. So basically what Rambam is saying is that Yecheskel in his vision was recognizing the difference between essential motion and non-essential motion. The greatness of this and why this is so amazing is that what the Rambam is telling you is the Rambam is looking at this verse and he is interpreting it with as if Aristotle, was being like he's reading science into this verse, right? He's reading Ezekiel's vision as if what Ezekiel was seeing was beings that decide to move and decide to do what God says versus wheels that don't have motion on their own, that are moved. So what Rambam is seeing is he's seeing physics, right? He insistently repeats this notion and reaffirms it several times. And he makes out that who's moving them? The living creatures are moving these wheels, right? So that, to use an image, the relation of a wheel to a living creature could be likened to what happens when one ties an inanimate body to the hands and feet of a living being. Every time the living being moves, if you tie a piece of wood or a stone to the person or the animal, then then that thing moves as well. Accordingly, he says, when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them. And he also says, and the wheels were lifted up facing them. And he explains the cause of this, saying, for the air of the living creature was in the wheels. So basically what Ezekiel is seeing, what is he seeing now? What's the Rambam telling us, right? What's all this business? What he's telling us is that what Ezekiel saw in this vision, right, which is this, sounds like this lofty spiritual vision of all kinds of angels and eyes and colors and wheels and creatures and magical creatures and wings and flying things and everything. What Ezekiel was really seeing was how the world works, right? What he was really seeing was the laws of nature, right? And the way God relates to this world, which is through the laws of nature, right? That's what the Rambam is telling us here. What Ezekiel saw was intelligences that act as they're supposed to, according to nature, because that's what God told them to do, and that's how God created the world, right? What Ezekiel sees is things that move because they have an intelligence and decide to move, and things that are moved by those things, okay? He repeats this notion in order to confirm it and make it understood. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth and the wheels were lifted up facing them, for the air of the living creature was in the wheels. Because these things move, because living creatures decide to make them move. Accordingly, the order of these motions is as follows. The living creatures moved in whatever direction it was the divine purpose. Now he sums it all up. The divine purpose that the living creatures should move, right? And by the motion of the living creatures, the wheels move, following the former through being bound to them. For the wheels do not of their own accord move the living creatures. It doesn't move the other way around, right? For the wheels do not, and he sets forth the order of that grade. Whithersoever the air will go, they will go thither as the air to go, and so on. I'm going to keep quoting this verse. I have already made known to you the translation of Yonasan ben Uziel before. When he had finished the description of the living creatures, I'm about to turn the page again. When he finished describing these creatures, of their forms and of their motions, and had mentioned the wheels that are beneath the living creatures, they're being bound to the ladder and moved with their motion, he starts to set forth a third apprehension that he had, and goes back to another description concerning that which is above the living creatures. And then he goes to, okay, so now what's above them? And now remember, in Maimonidean cosmology, which you and I are very familiar with, right? What is above? I think there's at least 3 cats trying to take part. I didn't realize that you guys had a cat too, but okay. They want to listen in. So remember, in Maimonidean cosmology and based on Aristotelian physics, right? Each sphere is as you go higher, right? The highest sphere, right, is being controlled, so to speak, is being moved by the force that comes directly from the prime mover, which is God, right? The prime mover through the active intellect, right, emanates towards the highest sphere. So above the highest sphere in Maimonidean cosmology is a place, which isn't a place. It's not an actual physical place. The Rambam told us that many times, but just because we don't have a better way to describe it, it's a place where our intellect cannot comprehend, cannot see, cannot know, right? But it's the sphere of God himself, right? So when Ezekiel is seeing this vision, right, what he sees now, when above it, now he's looking above those living creatures. Those living creatures are the angels that are making the spheres go around. Above that is what, right? What he sees there is a firmament, right? A firmament, or a rakia, right? Which is the Hebrew word for, sometimes translated as a heaven, but heaven isn't, or rakia is more like the thing that covers it all, right? It's the veil between that which we can perceive as terrestrial creatures and that which is beyond it, which we cannot perceive, right? So Ezekiel sees this firmament, and this is the limit. This is the limit beyond which we can't go. And then he sees above that, he sees the likeness of a throne and the appearance of a man. Now, he's going to get to that business with the appearance of a man, so I'm going to leave that aside, because that's obviously one of the most difficult parts of this entire vision. But he ends this chapter saying this is what he saw when he first apprehended by the river of Kibar, which is a river somewhere in Babylon, which is where Ezekiel had this vision. Excuse me for just 1 second. I need to take some tea. I'm shocked. So now, we'll talk about the man, and we did discuss that image of a man before, right? And why there was an image of a man, and he made it obviously very clear that Ezekiel did not mean to suggest that God has the form of a man, but that similar to what we have in Bereshit, where in Genesis, where it says that man is made in the likeness, God made men in his likeness, right? Which the meaning, Rambam explains this is way back in the beginning. If you go back to some of our first lectures, that the meaning of that is that we have wisdom, right? We have the ability to discern a truth from non-truth. But that's off subject. But chapter 3, and I'm on page 422. After Ezekiel, peace be upon him, had set forth the description of the chariot as given in the beginning of the book, right? So you and I, we studied together 2 weeks ago, chapter 1, right? But we also studied chapter 10, in which he had a second vision, right? And in that vision, he was born, he flew, like, not really, but he flew to Jerusalem. There's another religion that took this image out of Ezekiel and made it into somebody flying to Jerusalem, but we'll leave that religion alone for the moment. So Ezekiel flew to Jerusalem. Now remember, at the time that this vision happened, when Ezekiel flew to Jerusalem, right, in his vision, was the waning days of the Beit HaMikdash, was the days when the Beit HaMikdash was not yet destroyed, but about to be. And Yechezkel himself was a Kohen, right? He was a priest, And he was sent out with one of the first earlier exiles with the leadership, because the Babylonians first didn't destroy the temple. They just took all the leaders out in order to put down the rebellion, and they allowed the temple to stay. And so Ezekiel is now in his mind flying to the temple, right? And we read this together. We studied this together last week. Thereupon he explained to us things that at first had not been explained. Remember, he told us, and we read this together, that Ezekiel said this is the same, the chariot that he saw when on his trip to Jerusalem was the same chariot that he saw in his vision on Har Kivar, on the river of Kivar. The thing is, though, is that he added a lot of details and changed a few things. And remember, we discussed how he saw God's chariot rising from the Holy of Holies, entering the Holy, and eventually moving out to the city. It was the image, and it was a beautiful image. We described it last time, a beautiful in a way, but also terribly sad. The image of God's presence leaving the temple and going out with his people into exile, right? It was the image of God's presence that he saw leaving the temple and going out. But when he described God's chariot, he changed a few details. So let's talk about this. So he explained to us things that at first had not been explained. Thus, for our benefit, he replaced the word living creatures by the word cheruvim. He said those living creatures had the appearance of a cherub, right? Which is why the Rambam said that all of those creatures were human, had a human form. Because cheruvim, as we know, cherubs means a child's face, right? He says, and when the cheruvim went, the wheels went beside them. When the cheruvim lifted up their wings to mount up from the earth, the same wheels also turned not from beside them. Thus he confirms the fact that, as we have mentioned, the two motions were bound together. Again, that idea, right, that it was a human, right, it was a person or a being, a living, thinking being that makes the inanimate things move, right, was what Ezekiel was saying. Then he says, this is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Kivar. In other words, the Rambam keeps emphasizing that. Don't think that Ezekiel himself said that it was the same vision. Accordingly, he repeats the description of the self-same forms, the self-same motions, and makes it clear that the living creatures are the cheruvim, and the cheruvim are the living creatures. Thereupon, so what's Ezekiel seeing here? He's seeing human beings being the cause for the actions of the inanimate objects, right? And think about what that means. That's Aristotelian, but you have to understand in the context of what Ezekiel is saying. What people do, right, and what we do is what makes things in this world happen, right? The decisions that we make. Sometimes it could be as simple as deciding to throw a rock from here to there, but sometimes it could be a decision that leads to the destruction of the temple, right? That's the context in which Ezekiel is talking about. An action that we do that causes things in this world, and the rest of the world suffers because of our bad decisions and gains because of our good decisions. Thereupon he explains in the second description another notion, namely, and here's where he finally gets to the spheres, right? Remember the Aristotelian idea of the spheres that rotate around the world. We talked about that a million times. Namely, the notion that the wheels are the galgalim. The wheels are the spheres that rotate around the world. Because he says, as for the wheels, they were called, in my hearing, hagalgal, right? Then he explains the third notion regarding the wheels, saying with reference to them, but to the place whither the head looked, they followed, and they turned not as they went. Now remember, Rambam told us a lot about Aristotelian physics before, that the galgalim, the spheres, are constantly moving in the same direction. One of the main problems of that physics, which was perplexed people until Galileo and Copernicus' time, when they finally started to realize that there are no spheres going around, was that how come we see certain constellations move this way and then they move that way, right? It just didn't make any sense. And they had to come up with all kinds of explanations, because the galgal is always moving in the same direction. Remember, Aristotle said that the only motion that's continuous is a circle, because it constantly goes around and around. It's always going the same way, right? So it's the most perfect kind of motion in Aristotelian physics. So here he states explicitly that the compulsory motion of the wheels followed to the place whither the head looked. It always went in that same direction in which the head was facing. That is to say, as he explained, it followed whither the air will be, right? The ruach. that was pushing it. Then he adds a fourth notion about the wheels, and the wheels were full of eyes round about it, right? And even the wheels that they four had. He did not mention this notion at first. Then he says in the last apprehension with regard to the wheels, their flesh and their backs and their hands and their wings. At first, he had not mentioned that the wheels had flesh or hands or wings, but only that they were bodies. Finally, however, he goes so far as to say that they have flesh, hands, and wings, but he does not ascribe to them any form whatsoever. In the second apprehension, he also explains that every wheel is related to a cherub. There was a cherub for each wheel, right? Which makes sense, again, according to Aristotle. If everything that moves needs to have an intelligence that makes it move. He also explains that the four living creatures are one living creature because the adherence of all of them to one another. This is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Kavar. Similarly, so again, all of these beings are essentially one. They all attach back to the same ultimate source, the prime mover himself. Similarly, he calls the wheels one wheel upon the earth, in spite of there being, as he also mentions, four wheels. These are the explanations. I skipped a tiny drop regarding the forms of the living creatures and the wheels that are added for our benefit in the second apprehension. So we got to continue because it's all the chapter 4. It's going to go on for a bit, but again, I want to call attention to something here, and that is that what Rambam is trying to allow us to do and give us permission to do is to take. He purposely does not choose all of Tanakh to do this, right? He purposely chooses the most difficult chapter in Tanakh, the one that is seemingly the least rationalistic, the least scientific, right? And he's trying to show us a path of how we can look at this and see what Ezekiel is trying to say. What is this vision that he's seeing? What is the mashal? The Rambam often uses the term mashal. What is the parable to be found in all of this, right? And when he does this for this chapter, that gives us permission to take any chapter in Tanakh, right, which we find difficult, and find its metaphorical meaning, right? And that's why this is so crucial, right? All of a sudden, the Rambam, as he told us before he started this, as he says, it's very possible that somebody else could look at this and see something else. I think I'm right, Rambam said, but you might look at this and see something else. But this Rambam is here by he's giving us a key. He's giving us permission to open the Tanakh. And when we read a very strange passage that it just doesn't sound sensible, it doesn't make sense, and we can read it and understand it in a metaphorical way and try to use the science and knowledge that we know about this world to make sense of it, right? So just keep that in mind as we read through this. And those are the secrets. We're not going to understand every little bit that Rambam is trying to lighten up in our minds, but using the knowledge we've gained in the first two parts of studying Maimonides together, we do have a little bit of hints, and we can see some of these flashes. It behooves us to draw your attention to a certain thought adopted by Yonasan ben Azil. I'm starting chapter 4 on page 423. When he saw the explicit statement, as for the wheels, they were called in my hearing Hagalgal, he categorically decided that the wheels are the heavens, which is fascinating because it's only in Rambam's mind. In Rambam's mind, if he sees the word Galgal, which is the Hebrew word for the spheres, which in Rambam's Aristotelian mind means the spheres that rotate around in the heavens, right? You and I might see the word Galgal and think of something else. I mean, if you speak modern Hebrew, you think of a Galgal. You're not thinking of the spheres. You're thinking of wheels, right? The wheels of a train, right? The wheels of, whatever. You're not thinking of this. But the Rambam says he categorically decided the wheels are the heavens, right? Which is why he called it a Galgala, which is a sphere. And Ophanim, by the word Galgalia, right? So I have no doubt that to his mind, peace be upon him, this interpretation was corroborated by the dictum of Yechezkel, peace be upon him, regarding the wheels, that they were like it to the color of beryl, right? Which is kind of a blue color attributed to the heavens, as is generally known. So as you look up to the heaven, you see these Ophanim, these Galgalim, and these Galgalim are representative of those spheres. And we learned at length earlier together what the function of these Galgalim are and how and why they move. However, when he found the text, now as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth, which indubitably definitely indicates that the wheels are upon the earth, this appeared to him. He thought it's a difficulty regarding this interpretation because there are no wheels on the earth. Remember, the wheels stop with the sphere of the moon. The sphere of the moon is the lowest sphere, and we all live in the world that's beneath the sphere of the moon. So accordingly, he went further in his interpretation, interpreting the word earth as referring to the surface of heaven, which is an earth with respect to what's above it. Accordingly, he translated, one wheel upon the earth beneath the height of heaven. Understand this interpretation as it is in reality. It seems to me he was led to this by his belief that Galgal is a term designating in the first place the heavens. But I think it's different, the Rambam says. I think the Hebrew term for rolling is legalgel, is to roll. In Hebrew, the word legalgel means to roll. If you're rolling a ball down a hill, what you're doing is being megalgel, right? So, thus, roll thee down, vigilgalticha, from the rocks. And he rolled vayagel at the heaven, right? He rolled the stone. For this reason, it is said, and like a rolling thing, uchigalgal, right? So because of its rolling. For this reason, too, the cranium, the skull in Hebrew is called the gulgolet, right? Why? Because of it's being kind of round in shape. So because every sphere rolls, so anything that's spherical is called a galgal, right? So the Rambam is correcting Yonasan ben Uziel. Yonasan ben Uziel thought that the galgal is the sphere, right? Rambam is saying that it doesn't necessarily mean the sphere that rotates, but anything round. The heavens were called galgalim because they're round, because they're spherical, right? Accordingly, the sages say it is a revolving galgal, right? So for the self-same reason, they likewise call a pulley a galgal. Accordingly, Ezekiel's dictum, as for the wheels, they were called hagalgal, makes their shape known to us. So what he's trying to teach us is that they are round. So again, the Rambam is saying, he's applying his knowledge of science, right? And he's saying that when Ezekiel saw these ophanim, he was referring to the galgalim in these spheres. For he does not ascribe to them any shape or form, except by saying that they are galgalim. With regard to saying about them like unto beryl, that they had that bluish appearance, he interprets this also in the second description, saying with regard to the wheels. And the appearance of wheels were like that. Now you already know that Onkelos used this very expression to translate as it were, a work of whiteness of kalivnas asapir, right? Which is in the Torah, which is in the book of Exodus, right? There was talking about where the Sanhedrin saw visions of God and were prophesying. So there's consequently no difference between it saying and the color of the beryl stone or saying it's the sapphire stone. It's the same thing. You must not find it incongruous that having mentioned the interpretation of Yonasan ben Uziel, I propounded a different interpretation. It's okay. And I was having this discussion with my son earlier. It's all right that Yonasan ben Uziel and I argue. Remember, Yonasan ben Uziel would have been at the time of the Mishnah, the time of Chazal. So you will find that many among the sages, even among the commentators, differ from his interpretation with regard to certain words and many notions that are set forth by the prophets. How could this not be with regard to these obscure matters? People are going to argue over this. Rambam told you himself that you could argue on me and you might be right, right? Understand, moreover, I do not oblige you to decide in favor of my interpretation. I want to emphasize why this is so important, what the Rambam is saying. Because the Rambam knows, and I've seen there's several scholarly articles I've read on this topic, and this is one of the proofs that they bring to the following. A lot of people debate, and they ask the question, Rambam is writing all of these explanations based on Aristotelian physics. What would Rambam have done, right, if he was alive today and Aristotelian physics was out the window? Obviously, he wouldn't have explained this whole chapter about Galgalim, which is an archaic form of physics, which we now know is completely bogus, right? And totally off. But so the Rambam is saying over here, he's giving us permission, and he does this repeatedly. He's saying, I know and I understand that thoughts might change, that ideas might change, and people might have other ideas. So the Rambam is telling you, you can disagree with my understanding of what the Galgal is, and what the colors are, and why the barrels, and what the heaven means, and what above the heavens means. You have my permission to disagree, right? But what you need to get permission from the Rambam to do is to look at this entire chapter in a non-literal form and find meaning in it. Every single one of us here has now the Rambam's permission to go ahead and do what Yonasan ben Uziel did and do what the Rambam did, who kind of updated Yonasan ben Uziel about a couple hundred years later, right? And what you and I can do today. with our knowledge of the world, maybe we can look at Ezekiel and see it and understand it in a completely different way, which is totally fine, right? As long as we don't understand it literally, right? Which would be blasphemous, right? And that's really the greatness of these chapters here. Understand the whole of his interpretation from that to which I have drawn your attention, and understand my interpretation. God knows in which of the two interpretations there is a correspondence to what has been intended. In other words, only God really knows, right, who's right, who has the right meaning of Ezekiel. But we all have permission to look at it and try to understand it our way. And the truth is, between you and I, there's probably some kernels of truth in all of it. To the extent that Ezekiel, when he saw this vision, understood Aristotelian physics, I looked back that the idea of these spheres, I did some very, very cursory Google research, right? And I found that the earliest, I can't even remember the name, but some Greek guy, and somewhere around the year, the 4th or 5th century BCE, was the first person to describe this idea of the spheres, okay? It's not that far off from the time that Ezekiel lived, okay? So it's plausible, right, that the knowledge of the spheres, whichever the Greek guy that made it, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Someone can Google it and find out, but who's the first person to mention it. But it preceded Aristotle. It was in the Greek thoughts, and it might have probably preceded whoever it was that said it, because that was the first guy we know that said it. But the idea of Galgalim probably preceded that. And it's extremely likely, or at least extremely reasonable to presume, that in Ezekiel's mind, he had some sort of idea of the cosmos that was similar. And when he's going to describe nature in a vision like this, these are the kinds of things that he would see. So to say that like the Rambam is arguing, that Ezekiel saw that his vision can be explained with Aristotelian physics is not that far off. Because remember, it's a vision. And of course, Ezekiel is going to see things in the way he understood them, just like you and I will see things in the way we understand things, right? And the ultimate purpose of the vision then is to teach us these lessons, right? Is to teach us the lesson, that human beings have control over the movement of nature. The paper that we are what we decide to do results in movement and things that don't have the ability to make decisions to move, right? When we do God's bidding, we're supposed to do it straight without turning here or there. If we're supposed to do A, we go do A, and that's it. That's the direction we're supposed to go, and so on and so forth. And there's many different directions in which we can go. There's 4 faces, 4 ways, right? These are the kinds of things that we're supposed to learn. It's a lot. There's about a couple more chapters that we're going to be dealing with this, and I don't know. I'm trying to think if I should try one more. Let's see if we can get through 5. And I'm kind of getting tired. I want to open the floor to questions first, and then we'll see if we have time left to do chapter 5. Nobody. Everyone's blown away by the spheres and the heavens and the blue skies and all kinds of things. So let's just read chapter 5, and I promise you, book 3 has tons of, as I made the promise in the beginning, has tons and tons of stuff that you're gonna, which will give us a lot to think about when he gets in. The most famous part of this book is where he talks about the reasons for the mitzvot, and the logic behind the laws of the Torah. But this is really important because he's really teaching us how we're supposed to learn the Torah when the Torah says things that don't seem to make sense. So among the things to which your attention ought to be directed is his expression, visions of God. Okay. So remember Ezekiel 1:1, the beginning of this entire thing. I'll read it to you in the original Hebrew, right? Marot Elohim, right? The way Ezekiel describes his thing is he says, and I saw, and remember this, I'm translating in past tense because it's another example right here, which we had tonight of literally it would be in proper Hebrew, that would be future, and I will see, but in biblical Hebrew, especially with the Vav HaMahapech, means I saw Marot Elohim. So all of this stuff that he's seeing is subsumed under Marot Elohim, visions in plural of godliness, of God. He does not say vision. He does not say that I saw a vision in the singular, but visions. Because there were many apprehensions differing in species. I mean to say 3 apprehensions. There was 3 basically different apprehensions, categories of things that he apprehended. And Rambam deliberately is choosing the term apprehensions here, right? Because remember, Rambam says that these are things that he's perceiving. He's not actually seeing them. This is a dream. This is a vision. So he perceives an image in his brain. He didn't actually see something like I see this computer screen right now. He apprehended it, right? So what are these 3 things? Is that of the wheels, that of the living creatures, and that of the man, right, who is above the living creatures. Okay, and he described this all in detail before, which we just read. With regard to every apprehension, he says, and I saw. With reference to the apprehension of the living creatures, he says, and I saw, and behold, the whirlwind, and so on. With reference to apprehension of the wheels, and I saw the living creatures, and behold, one wheel upon the earth. Rambam described to us before that the creatures that he saw on the earth were those there was a wheel built beneath them. And with reference to the man who is in degree above the living creatures, he says, and I saw the color of chashmal, right? Now, remember, chashmal, we don't really know what it means. In modern Hebrew, it came to mean electricity, but it's some sort of a glowing, shining something or other. No one really knows how to translate the word chashmal, so I'm not going to certainly do that. And so on, from the appearance of his loins and so on. In the description of the chariot, he only repeats the word I saw those 3 times. So when he describes the Maaseh Merkava, which is this vision, the only time he uses the word I saw was when he talks about those 3 ideas. Okay? The sages of the Mishnah have already explained this matter. In fact, it is they who drew my attention to this. For they said, it is permissible to teach the first 2 apprehensions only, the apprehensions of the living creature and the apprehension of the wheels, whereas only the chapter headings may be taught with regard to the 3rd apprehension, which is this chashmal that he saw, this glow that came out. However, our holy rabbi, that's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the compiler of the Mishnah himself, arguably the greatest of all of the Mishnaic rabbis, right, believes that all 3 apprehensions are called the account of chariot, and respect to none of them may anything other than the chapter headings be taught. Right, which the Rambam was kind of following along these past few chapters. He was dropping off chapter headings, and he left it to us to expound on them, which is why I kind of expounded on them to the extent that I could, which is probably only a tiny, tiny drop of what the Rambam had in mind. Their text with regard to this as follows. Until where is it permissible to teach the Maaseh Merkava? Rabbi Meir says, until the last I saw. Rabbi Yitzchak says, until the word chashmal, and so on. You can read through. I just turned to page 426. Some say, from the first, and so in other words, they're arguing over which parts of it are more esoteric than the others. It has thus become clear to you from their text that there were various apprehensions to which attention is drawn by the expression, and I saw, and I saw, and I saw. The bottom line being is that the things that he apprehended. I mean the apprehension of the form of the divided man, which it said, from the appearance of his loins and upward, and from the appearance of his loins and downward, right? Let me read that. That's in verse 27. It's farther than where I got to so far today, but it's near the end of the chapter. Right? I saw something like this gleam, this chashmal that looked like a flame glow, which was around it, right? Which encased it, beitla, which like encased it, like housed it around it. Mimare matnavu lamala, from and this is Ezekiel describing God, the vision of God himself. Well, I shouldn't say God himself. Let me read verse 26, and you'll understand why Rambam is sitting on this. This is the most difficult part. Remember, he talked about the heaven, he talked about the throne, and in verse 26 it says, "V'al demut akise, demut k'marei adam alav milmala." And on this throne, I saw something that appeared like a human being. So there's right. V'eira, and I saw ke'ein chashmal, like some kind of a glow, k'marei eish, like a flame, beit lasaviv, that encased this human form around it. So it seems to be describing his vision of God himself, right? So that's why everyone seems to agree that this part you really shouldn't teach the public, because people can get really, really, really heretical ideas from this, and they'll think that this is actually describing what God looks like. And then it continues to say, Mimarei matnav milmala, this encasing light was from the appearance of his loins above, right? Umi marei matanav lamata, from his loins down, ra'isi kamare esh. That looked different. It was just a fire, not a chashmal kamare esh, but just kamare esh. V'no galos aviv, and there was some kind of radiant glow surrounding it. And then he describes that radiant glow as kamare hakeshet, like the appearance of the rainbow, right? So again, this is kind of a support for Rambam's assertion that ayin does not mean colors. It does not mean eyes, but it means light colors, which because the 7 colors of the rainbow are glowing from his lower half. So all of this just seems extremely difficult, right? So there's a difference of opinion among the sages whether it's permissible for it to be alluded to in any way. So are you allowed to teach it in any way at all? Similarly, there is also, as you see, a difference of opinion among the sages with regard to the first 2 apprehensions. So, but then I'm just going to go to the last paragraph of this chapter, and that's what we'll end with tonight. You ought also to have your attention directed to the order of these 3 apprehensions. Thus, so if you really want to try to make some meaning out of this, think about the order. The living creatures, for they come first because of their nobility and their causality, according to what he says, for the air of the living creature was in the wheels, and because of other things too. After the wheels comes the 3rd apprehension, right? So first he apprehended the living creatures, then he apprehended the wheels, right? The reason for this lies in the fact that the first 2 apprehensions necessarily precede the 3rd in order of knowledge, the latter being inferred with the help of the other 2. So the bottom line is he's trying to say is the way everything works is there's living creatures that make decisions to do things, and we affect the non-living creatures, which are the wheels, and all of this works because of what's above them, which is this apprehension of the chashmal, that energy that comes from God himself. So again, this is very Aristotelian, God being the prime mover that gives energy to living beings to move non-living beings. So what Rambam just said was, in these 3 apprehensions of Ezekiel, what Rambam just saw was Aristotelian physics in action. Does that make sense? So that would end chapter 5. I do understand and admit that this is not necessarily the most exciting chapters in the Rambam, but if you really try to let it sink in at how important this is to how to read the Torah, then we can understand just how this will affect and the next time you open a Chumash and don't understand what you're reading. So we'll stop here tonight. We still have more of the Ezekiel visions to do for the next couple chapters before we move on to the next topic. But let me open the floor for any comments before we close up for the evening.
I understand that the Kabbalists have a view of heaven that contains spheres, but they're not one sphere inside of another. Is that do you?
Yeah, well, they call them sphirot, but sphirot, according to the Kabbalists, is really they are spheres because they also viewed the world as spheres, but it's levels, more like, one sphere talks to the influences the one below it, which influences the one below it, and so on and so forth. And when we act and influence what goes on in the heavens, what we do down here affects the lowest sphere, which affects the one above it, which affects the one above it, and so on. A part of me wants to study, after we finish Rambam, is we study Zohar together. The little piece of me wants to do that. The other piece of me wants to do Kuzari. Both for similar reasons, by the way. Even though Kuzari is very different. Kuzari is a philosophical book, but it's a philosophical book that is largely seen, especially from modern eyes, as the counter Maimonidean Jewish philosophy book, right? And it's largely seen as the Jewish philosophy book, which has influenced the direction that Orthodox Judaism, what eventually became called Orthodox Judaism today, right, mostly took the non-Maimonidean approach, right? But the Kuzari is a wonderful. I mean, it doesn't need me to give him an approbation, but it's important for us to read because it'll help us understand how, in many ways, Maimonides was extremely influential, but in many ways he lost the game to the Kuzari, right? And people debate, and people that like to have these debates debate all the time who is more influential on the subsequent Jewish thought for till today. But so that part of me wants to do Kuzari. That similar part of me wants to do Zohar next, because Zohar and Kabbalah and mysticism is so much different than the Maimonidean philosophy. It's like some people also believe that Rambam wrote this book that we're reading in order to prevent, kind of in order to stem the tide or to keep people away from going down that mystical path. And he wanted to keep people on what he viewed as the true scientific path, which he saw it in Aristotelian terms. And some people see the Zohar as somewhat of a reaction to Rambam, as a counter Maimonidean. There's a really good book by Menachem Kellner, who I quote a million times. It's called Rambam, Maimonides' Confrontation with Mysticism. If I get it, I might have the words slightly off, but it's something like that. I highly recommend the book. It's just wonderful, wonderful book. It's
what
called,
is the author's name again?
Menachem Kellner, Kellner. If you just Google Kellner Mysticism Maimonides, you'll find the book. It's an absolutely wonderful book and very highly recommended. I enjoyed it. It sits in a prominent place in my library. But he talks about so that's the part of me that wants to do Zohar next. We still got time. We got at least a year and probably at least a year to go until we finish the book, depending on how fast we go. But so I'm just putting those two ideas out there, and you guys can think about other ideas. But we definitely will continue this after Rambam. But the question is, well, another option is to study some of the other Rambam's works, like to do the Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters, which is another very important philosophical part of the Rambam's writings. We can do from the Mishnah Torah, we can do Hilchotei, the Sefer Mada, which has we could do some of his letters. We can continue with Maimonides. We can make this into a Maimonides only class, but we still got time. I'm just putting ideas out there for you guys to think about.
Just
yeah.
I've been told that there is a new translation coming out of the guide for the Perplexed. Maybe you are aware of that. I don't know, but the author is supposed to come to Washington and to have a talk. Maybe he's promoting his book sometime next week, I think, or something.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm aware is that there are several scholarly Hebrew new translations of the Rambam that came out in the last a decade or two. Several really good ones, but for my Hebrew translation, I'm still using. Remember, the reason why I feel completely, I always like to read original text. My problem is I don't read Judeo-Arabic, certainly not medieval Judeo-Arabic. So I can't open the Rambam and read it in the original. So almost everyone that studies Rambam today, Moreh Nevuchim, is studying a translation. So I think the English translations are just as legit as the Hebrew ones, right? Because they're both translations of the Arabic. So it's not like, but usually if I read a Hebrew text, I'm reading the original, but the Hebrew is not original either. So the translation that I'm using is been around for a while, and it's very well known and well respected. But he was Shlomo, I keep calling him Pines because that's how I'm pronouncing him my whole life. But the proper pronunciation of his name is Shlomo Penis, right? And his teacher was Leo Strauss, who had a very particular understanding of Maimonides, which I'll admit heavily influenced my own, because this is how I learned the Rambam. I read the Pines and I read the Leo Strauss's intro, and this is how I learned it. And every translation is more than just a translation. It edges in a certain direction. It kind of so and there's a lot of scholars today that go back to the original Rambam and feel that and have different approaches than Strauss did. We don't have time now to go into the different schools of thought here, but maybe another time I can discuss some of the different schools of thought. But let me just say one thing, that a lot of the differences have to do with the contradictions that in one place and another place in the Rambam, and the idea of esotericism, about how much the Rambam said which was only meant for select people to know and understand. There's a lot. There's a lot. And Strauss was a particular school which dominated for until maybe about 20, 30 years ago, dominated the field of Maimonidean scholarship. In the last 20, 30 years, a lot of people have written a lot of stuff. If you read the books that I suggest, you'll get different things. A good place to start is Kellner. Another good place to start, and I've recommended his stuff a few times, is Zieskin, Kenneth Zieskin. He's up at the University of Chicago. The reading their works will get you started on it, and both of those are things that you don't have to be an ivory tower, a Ivy League scholar to understand, and they'll shed light on different ways of understanding Maimonides.
Thank you.
All right. Any other comments before we close up? If not, we'll go back to Ezekiel's visions next week. Even if you're getting bored of them, I'm sorry. I told you we're going to learn straight from beginning to end. I'm not stopping if things seem less exciting. But yeah. So thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank
Take care.
you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.